12 days out, early votes are already in the box, and the Sacramento Bee's 1,200 voter poll says this thing has narrowed to two names, Hilton and Becerra. This is California governor's race. Today, we're stress testing that consolidation story, VoteHub's three frontrunner frame, and the YIMBY coalition that somehow can't agree on any of them.
And before we hand this a two-person race label, I want to know who counts as a likely voter in a California June primary, because that screen may be doing most of the talking right now.
Yeah, that's the right place to start. Let's dig in. Here's Sacramento Bee.
Republican Steve Hilton and Democrat Xavier Becerra are consolidating support in the race to replace Governor Gavin Newsom ahead of the June 2nd primary, according to a poll of 1,200 likely California voters released Tuesday. The survey, which was commissioned by the California Democratic Party, shows Hilton as the top choice for 22% of likely voters, Becerra 1 point behind him, Democrat Tom Steyer at 15% support, and Republican Chad Bianco with 10%.
Sacramento Bee, 1,200 likely voters, paid for by the California Democratic Party. Hilton at 22, Becerra at 21, Steyer at 15, Bianco at 10. That tightening we flagged last edition now has a real number on it. The sourcing wrinkle, though, is obvious. The California Democratic Party funded the poll, and their chair is using it to say the field-clearing push is basically done.
Rusty Hicks says he doesn't see an urgent need to trim the field anymore, which is pretty rich, considering trimming it didn't exactly work. But I'm more interested in who's getting helped by that likely voter screen. In a California governor's primary with early ballots already out, that likely overweights the most reliable partisans, which flatters Becerra and may be hiding whatever decline to state upside Hilton actually has.
And compare that with the state Democratic Party's earlier polling. No field dates released, no sample methodology. The Bee at least gives us 1,200 likely voters and a publication date. That's not the full picture, but it's a real floor to stand on.
Porter, Mahan, Villaraigosa, Thurmond, all sitting in single digits in the party's own commissioned data. If you're at 4 or 5% with 12 days left and ballots already moving, that's not a campaign anymore. That's a legacy tour. California hasn't elected a Republican governor since Arnold Schwarzenegger, so it's easy to assume Democrats just run the table. But who actually turns out in a primary? And does that warp the picture of where this race really is?
That's the key distinction this cycle. Start with the basics. As of February 2025, about 22.9 million of California's 26.9 million eligible adults were registered to vote, about 85%, per the Public Policy Institute of California. But registered doesn't mean voting. PPIC's likely voter research shows enthusiasm and past voting habits are the real filters. And the people who get through those filters tend to be older, more engaged, and more ideologically consistent than the broader electorate. On party registration, Democrats are about 45% of registered voters statewide, Republicans about 25%, per PPIC's voter profiles. But in a low turnout primary, each party's most reliable base dominates, so the electorate that actually decides the primary can look very different from California at large. Then add the jungle primary. Everybody runs on one ballot, regardless of party, and the top two finishers advance to November. So if Democrats split badly across a bunch of candidates, they can actually hand both top two slots to Republicans, which is exactly the scenario State Democratic Party Chair Rusty Hicks has been warning about publicly, per Cal Matters.
So if a poll shows a Democrat leading comfortably among registered voters, that might not tell us much about how the primary itself actually shakes out.
Exactly. Registered voter polls cast the widest net. Likely voter screens are much tighter. And in a jungle primary with a crowded Democratic field, the math can move in ways the top line doesn't really show. The question isn't just who's ahead. It's whether any Democrat can pull enough of that fragmented vote together to lock down a top two spot before June. Here's ABC7 San Francisco.
Marin County, California, KGO. Riverside County Sheriff Chad Bianco is closing out the final stretch of California's gubernatorial primary by pitching himself as a political outsider, ready to aggressively upend Democratic leadership in Sacramento. At one point earlier this year, public polling suggested Bianco had a legitimate path to the November runoff, with some surveys showing two Republicans potentially advancing in California's unusual top two primary system.
ABC7 caught Bianco in Marin County. Marin County, of all places, where he told them he'd govern extensively through executive action. That's now on the record, in his own words, from his own camp.
And VoteHub's primary preview doesn't even put him in the front-runner tier. It's Hilton, Becerra, Steyer. So this executive action tour is happening outside the top line, which leaves the obvious question. Is that a closing argument or an audition tape for whatever comes after June 2nd?
The Sacramento Bee poll showing Hilton consolidating is what really quantifies Bianco's problem. There was a moment earlier this year when two Republicans advancing wasn't a fantasy. Now it's getting much harder to say that with a straight face.
Early votes are already in the box. If the Republican lane has collapsed to Hilton, Bianco's executive action pledge costs him almost nothing politically, because in the jungle math, he doesn't have much left to lose.
The Real Deal, with Christopher Neely.
Yet, the YIMBYs at large were unable to get behind a single candidate ahead of the June 2nd primary, showing that despite the movement's monolithic messaging that more housing is good housing, it is divided on who can best achieve it.
The Real Deal's Christopher Neely has the coalition story I keep coming back to this week. YIMBY Action endorsed Steyer, but the broader movement couldn't land on one candidate. That's not just a messaging issue. That's a structural clue about whether any of these housing plans are actually credible or just well packaged.
YIMBY activists punch above their weight in high-propensity primaries. These are exactly the voters who show up. So the split isn't just optics. It's real votes scattering across the field 12 days out, when consolidation is the only thing that really moves jungle math.
And that closes a loop we've been circling since Tuesday. Pick your issue, single-payer or housing or whatever else. California's activist coalitions are united on the crisis and split on the candidate. That isn't an accident. That's the race.
Steyer gets YIMBY Action's grassroots arm, promises 1 million homes in 4 years, and still the rest of the movement blinks. If you can't bring the true believers with you on your signature issue, what exactly is the closing argument?
VoteHub, with Ellis Bates.
With early voting now underway, Californians are beginning to cast their ballots ahead of the state's June 2nd primaries. The top two vote-getters, regardless of party affiliation, will advance to the November general election.
VoteHub's Ellis Bates frames the three frontrunners as a billionaire political activist, a former Biden-era cabinet secretary, and a British-American TV host. And that framing is doing real work now that early ballots are physically in the box. California's top two system was built for an era when the two parties sorted things out in advance. It was not built for this.
And look at who's missing from that frontrunner tier. Mahan, Porter, Bianco are all at or above 5%, which in a jungle primary with 60-plus names on the ballot is not nothing. The nightmare where both Republicans advance stops being theoretical the minute Hilton consolidates and Bianco holds 5.
The Sacramento Bee poll dropped Tuesday, 1,200 likely voters, and it's the first independent data point we can actually set next to the state Democratic Party's poll, which had no field dates and no sample methodology published. Two very different levels of rigor, and now we can compare what they spit out.
Right, but those likely voter screens in a California June primary are doing a ton of work. If the screen overweights high-propensity partisans, it flatters Becerra and can hide Hilton's decline to state upside, which is exactly the number I want before I buy the consolidation story as settled.
If you're tracking California's governor's race, you may also like Los Angeles Politics and Urbanism Daily. City Hall, housing abundance, homelessness response, metro, public safety, and small business permitting. Find it wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to dig further into any of the campaign moves or polling we covered today, you'll find links to every story in the show notes. Take a look at the ones you want to spend more time with. That's California governor's race for today. This is a Lantern podcast.